Sadly for us Trickster mains, we got a pretty solid nerf a couple of days ago, and it's been hard to push the challenge tiers since that time, but I have figured out a way to supplement that straight damage loss with damage from a different source, and I'm going to teach you how to do it. This video is sponsored by you. If you're going to enjoy this video, be sure to hit that big red button and do all those YouTube things, you know how it goes. So this build video is going to be in a little bit of a different order to normal. We're going to start with some overview and the equipment and mods, and then get into your skills and your class tree towards the end. As always, I do have the specific sections of the video marked in the description down below. So this build playstyle pretty much plays exactly the same as my Assault Reaver build if you have watched that video. However, we have switched to the Assassin tree and we are using shotguns with bleed, and we're specifically using a lot of bleed mods here to help increase our damage overall and get it back to a really high number. And the downside really is that we are a glass cannon, so you constantly need to be killing enemies for that health regen, as well as getting some weapon leech from some of the mods we're using. But overall, as long as you're killing enemies, this build is pretty successful, and I do a absolute ton of damage. Basically how this works is we are using bleed to supplement some of the damage loss from the nerf. Using bleed means that we can have something like vampiric mod on our gear, which replenishes our magazine when you kill an enemy that is affected by bleed, and my weapon has the tier 3 bleed on it so that every enemy is affected by bleed, so this is constantly refreshing my mag. What this allows is to free up that second slot on your weapon so you can drop Perpetua Mobile and run a damage mod instead. I've been running the tier 3 Storm Whip here, and this does a significant amount of extra damage, and you can see it in the breakdown at the end of the expeditions that Storm Whip is actually my second highest damage number next to Twisted Rounds. So this is basically what we're doing to supplement some of that damage that we've lost, as well as putting points into other bleed mods. So what we're doing here is running Bloody Boost to boost your damage to enemies affected by bleed by 15%. I'm also running Thirst for Blood so that when I do hit enemies with bleed, I get a weapon leech by 40% for 10 seconds. So this is all about getting some health back, and I'm still running defensive mods like Mitigation from Death just to get a little bit of health and armor back with this amount of damage that we are putting out. Running things like close range weapon damage and shotgun weapon damage, and I've kind of been tinkering around with this Chrono Suit legendary set, as I do have the gloves as well, and the benefit that you get from having the set, so reverting time replenishes your ammo in your clip, is a good backseat option because we aren't running Perpetua Mobile. You know, if you are hitting an elite and they do take up most of your rounds, you're not going to get that mag refresh. You can then pop borrowed time so that you do get your mag back. However, what I've kind of found, and I think it's the case for most legendaries, is the actual stats on them, like these gloves especially, being max health, close range damage, and cooldown reduction, they're not the greatest, especially the max health. This chest piece is okay, and the head isn't actually that bad either, but the tier 3 mods that are on them, you can supplement them out for other things. So I'm kind of in the process at the moment of replacing this gear with other pieces like these gloves here that have the God Roll of Firepower, close range, and cooldown reduction, which is still the focus for this build. They're your top 3 things that you need to focus on, as well as having these bleed mods on your gear. And then other than that, the real things I'm running is your common Twisted Rounds buffs. So the main one is the skill is effective by 2 magazines before triggering the cooldown, being the additional mag. I do want to change, if I was going to drop both of these Chrono Suit pieces for something that was better, I would put more buffs into my Twisted Rounds, something like Blue Blood, or increasing my firepower while it's active overall, but I haven't found a piece that is good enough to replace these two that I'm currently rocking at the moment. So once I do have that, I will replace that, but this is really what I've been doing for the gear aspect of it. For my skills, I'm still pretty much running the same skills: Twisted Rounds, Borrowed Time, and Venetta's Knife. Now, Twisted Rounds is an absolute must with pretty much every Trickster build, so there's not too much that we need to talk about there. Venetta's Knife is a really good ability that slows enemies around you. It also means that your next hit does double damage. I typically use this very often, especially on elites, to slow them as well as get that extra damage into them when I am smashing down elites. And I personally prefer Borrowed Time to Hunt the Prey. I know that Hunt the Prey is considered the best option here, but in my opinion and what I prefer is Borrowed Time. One, because it always works. Now, the issue with Hunt the Prey is that it will occasionally not be able to find you a way to teleport to the enemy and it just won't work, and this can get you killed very regularly. The shield buff that you get from it is like half of what you get from Borrowed Time, so if you're using it as a get out of jail free card, it's not the best. And that's pretty much how I use it, as a get out of jail free card, as well as when it's active you get the increase to your weapon damage as well as to some of my resistances from the Chrono Suit set that I'm currently wearing. And I just prefer the way that Borrowed Time operates compared to Hunt the Prey. For our skill tree, I'm running a pretty typical just straight assassin line build. I have gone into Outrider Executioner so that when I do activate Borrowed Time, I get an increase of my weapon damage by 35%. Pretty much otherwise, it's a pretty typical class tree. The only difference here is that I'm not picking up Transfusion to increase weapon leech by 5%. I'm instead getting Death Probability to give me extra weapon damage by 8%, as this works out to be a better damage increase than the weapon leech. It could increase your survivability a little bit more with the weapon leech, but I feel like I'm getting enough of that based off my weapons being bleed and the effects that I'm getting from Thirst for Blood, so I don't think it's necessary for this build. I'm also not using Scion of Power, so when your damage skill ends, increase weapon damage by 35%. Being Twisted Rounds is the only skill that's affected by this, and I don't want my Twisted Rounds to end, so I'm not actually going to get a benefit from this skill, if that makes sense. Now, as always, some tips for playing this build, and as I mentioned, you are literally the definition of a glass cannon. You must be killing enemies constantly or else you will die very quickly. You could add some additional defensive mods to the ones that I am using. This will help alleviate some of that option. If you want some good tips for defensive mods and how to kind of progress in the endgame, you can check out my endgame guide, which goes through some of that stuff. But even still, you are still very weak in terms of how much damage you can actually take, especially to some of the other classes, because the way Trickster's healing works, that you do have to kill enemies to get that major health back, and you really want to be making sure that you're killing enemies as fast as possible for those benefits. During combat, when you are fighting these elites, it's a good idea to split your time between the weaker enemies and the elites, and focusing more on the weaker enemies so that you get the Vampiric Mag buff popping when you do kill them, as well as getting your health back. So I try and focus on the weaker enemies first and then melt down the elites second. Because of this, also, we don't want to be meleeing very often, pretty much ever, unless it's like an absolute must that you do need to use your melee, because if you do stop shooting and you're not killing enemies, you're going to die very quickly. To get your average eye level up, something that I didn't actually realize is that your secondary weapon and your pistol are calculated into your average item level. So make sure that you are keeping these topped up to whatever your average item level is. Even if you're not going to use them, it doesn't matter if it's a blue item or a epic or a legendary, whatever it is, just make sure that this is keeping up with your item level so that it calculates into your average item level, and that stays high, because your average item level is tied to your health and your anomaly power, and you want to keep these as close to the maximum level available to you as possible. If you're looking for more Outriders content, check out my Technomancer turret build that went live earlier this week. It's basically Torbjorn from Overwatch in Outriders, and it was a ton of fun to make, so go check that out. Please follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and on Twitch, where I stream 2 days a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays, Australian night times. Hope to see you guys there in the next stream. Thank you for watching this video. My name is NorZZa, and I hope you have a great day.